Hey there, I'm Scott, and this is Tangents. Well, before I do these, generally try to go back through my archives and kind of see if I've done the topic that I want to cover before. And I was kind of surprised that I didn't see this one, and I'm in fact a little bit doubtful that I didn't already do it because it seems like one that I would have done a long time ago. But as far as I know, I haven't done it yet. And if I did do it before, I don't know that it's necessarily like massively problematic to do the same one twice. In fact, I imagine if I do this long enough, I will probably go back and deliberately repeat some topics just because, I've updated my thinking on stuff or new events bring them into relevance again. But what I wanted to talk about today is actually skepticism. And skepticism is a thing that it's a very complicated sort of thing. It's one of those things where, on its surface, you'd be like, oh, well, it's like freedom of speech. You feel like, oh, skepticism is just good. And, oh, freedom of speech, just good. Turns out in practice, I used to be a just absolutist when it came to freedom of speech. And I've kind of revisited my thinking there a little bit. I listened to Penn and the whole idea of like, well, this is not him, but I can't remember the justice who said this in his decision, but it was basically the best remedy to bad speech is more speech, not less. Unless there's an urgent problem, you're supposed to add to the conversation. And I think this sounds like a good idea. It does fail to take into consideration the paradox of tolerance, which is to say that a tolerant society, which is extremely liberal in terms of freedom of speech and ability to get out and do things, protest, whatever, sets it's essentially a fertile growth medium for totalitarians because they can sit there and take advantage of that freedom of speech and of the freedom to organize and of all of these other things that you would instinctively think, and I would have years ago thought, just, oh, these are just unannealed goods. But they end up having a sort of, negative side to them. Sometimes massively so, like to the point where these things contain the seeds of their own destruction. In a totalitarian regime, you do not have freedom of speech. Freedom of speech leads to conditions which can create that. It's kind of interesting and a little bit concerning. I think really it just kind of comes down to the idea that, generally speaking, anytime you think you have a simple kind of universal truth, probably you're oversimplifying things, including the statement I just made. But the idea that you would have something where you're like, this is just always good under any circumstance, probably a red flag. So skepticism has kind of been on my mind a lot, and I've talked, I know, about appeal to authority and some of the problems that kind of come from that. There's a very good movement that, like, at one point in time, there was almost I guess you could call it a scientific priesthood, where you would have people who were considered, venerated experts, and it was not possible to really even question them to some extent. And obviously that's bad. I think anyone thinking would look at that and say, well, okay, if you have somebody who is an air quotes expert on something, they're definitely not always right. And that's absolutely true. It's also absolutely true that just because somebody has spent their life studying something doesn't mean that they know everything about it, doesn't mean that they have perfect decision-making ability or that they're not biased or anything like this. It can even mean sometimes that, you've become somewhat indoctrinated into a sort of set of core beliefs that may be fundamentally flawed. So that's one part. And so it does pay to be skeptical. It pays not to appeal entirely to authority. But at the same time, and here's the tension, if somebody's an expert in something, even when they're wrong about it probably for better reasons than you might be right if you don't know anything. Uh, so if you're right, what does it matter? Well, if you're saying something that goes contrary to something that an expert is saying, you may be right, but you're probably wrong. And you're probably, even if you're right, aren't right in a way that necessarily is significant or means anything. It may also be that you're right in the, air quotes right, in the sense that they've said something that is an oversimplification. And you're pointing out like a corner case, or like, well, under these circumstances, this, that expert may well have known that was an exception, or they may have, had that in their framework, but you're kind of making what you think is a massive correction, but to them is like a small perturbation. And of course, if you would actually have some kind of a dialogue here, then, rather than just talking on top of each other, then you might realize, oh, well, yeah, okay, I understand Newtonian gravity is not perfect. I have a PhD in physics. I didn't study astrophysics specifically. I did classical mechanics and this kind of stuff. But I can tell you, a lot of stuff about Newtonian gravity, and to tell you how it works and all this kind of stuff, tell you how to do calculations in it, variational calculus, all of this kind of stuff, the differential equations. And you might go, aha, but near the sun, the orbit of Mercury precesses in this way that doesn't fit that model. And then, you're right. Yeah, it doesn't fit that model. The funny thing is, of course, I have a PhD in physics. I know that. I've also studied general relativity. And I'm aware of this corner case. I'm also aware it's a small perturbation. I'm also aware that getting into the weeds there kind of complicates the picture. It's one thing, there are so many things about expertise that people don't appreciate. A lot of people think experts are just people who have, a handful of buzzwords. They know the vernacular. They know like a couple of little details, and those are details that you could pick up. I was going to say in like an hour, but maybe in like 5 minutes of Googling, if you wanted to. Just read the Wikipedia article, and then you feel like you're an expert. And one thing that's frustrating is that to a non-expert, if you start throwing out things like herd immunity, then immediately you sound like you know something. And in some sense you do. You know slightly more than the average person. Although, weirdly enough, herd immunity is now one of these things that has been thrust from kind of an obscure, not obscure in the sense that, obviously it's well known in epidemiological circles and in virology and all of these kinds of things. It was not really in the zeitgeist, the popular process of understanding, the popular knowledge base. It was not a term people would throw around. And so, and then you see it now, and on one hand, you're kind of like, well, that's good that more people know about it, but on the other hand, they know this sort of very oversimplified idea of it. They know it mostly in the sense that they are using it to kind of contradict, or in their minds, contradict things that other people have said. And they're really, it's both inappropriate and a shallow, kind of misguided understanding or misunderstanding of what it is. Interestingly enough, and this is something that when you have expertise in some subject, you'll see this all the time, but there are certain things, and I guess you could call this like a shibboleth, but there are certain things that are massive and obvious tells. And when somebody is an expert, like they're a genuine expert, they've spent years studying something, And I mean, it's easy to think, okay, well, they spent years studying this. I've just learned the summary in like 5 minutes. I know everything now. Ha ha ha. The whole Dunning-Kruger thing. When you're an expert and you're spending years studying something, it's not just that you've got that baseline that you're getting from the Wikipedia article. You're not just getting the sort of like high level, oh, this is how transcription and translation works. You are learning uh, many, many times over all kinds of subtle details. You're learning the same material several times. Like I've learned transcription and translation, I don't even know how many times. In high school biology, I know I took 2 years of biology in high school. Pretty sure we talked about transcription and translation, at least at a very high level, in both. And then I've taken microbiology, biology 181, 182, genetics, um, molecular biology and molecular genetics, virology, and I could just keep going on. Each one of these is a semester-long course, mind you. And in each one of these courses, we covered transcription and translation. And, on a high level, like I could give you a summary, like, well, the gene is encoded in the DNA, and then there's a transcriptase, which is an enzyme that takes that DNA strand and transcribes it into RNA. That RNA goes out into the endoplasmic reticulum and or some ribosome or wherever. And then tRNA comes in and translates that from messenger RNA to a protein, and then that protein to blah, 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 blah. I can summarize it very quickly. And so you'd think, like, why would you waste your time, Scott, studying this over and over and over again? And the thing about it is, like, even if all of those were exactly the same course, your perspective on it, when you've thought about it more and you've kind of let it percolate, changes. Like, the stuff that you hear in that is different. You get more layers of it each time. And certainly if you're an actual expert, the stuff that I just said, you kind of go like, well, yeah, kind of in summary, that's broad strokes true, but then there's all this other detail that kind of you glossed over. But also, in each one of those courses, we had a different kind of take on it. We went into different levels of detail. We went into different aspects of it. In virology, when you're doing it, you're covering certain things that you just don't cover in genetics. There are things that, like in genetics, you might mention, well, there are viruses that do this. But in virology, it's very interesting, like how viruses take over certain aspects of the cell's ability to translate message into protein and how they use that. And often they do things that circumvent some part of how the cell does it, or they'll do something which is a little bit this is kind of how the cell does it, but they're doing their own little special twist on it. And you start understanding like how this stuff works, how, and I think one of the big takeaways is that this is a subject where you could spend your entire life studying just that aspect of it. Or even like there are people who study as their PhD research or their postdoc work, or even as a professor, their research emphasis is just on how tRNA works or some aspect of that. Just on how like some tiny, tiny minutia thing functions. And there's a lot of detail and richness there that you're not getting when you're reading the sort of 10,000 foot summary on Wikipedia. And it's one of these things. So it's hard to understand or explain if you're not an expert on anything how this works. The other thing that I was starting to say, this shibboleth thing, is that when somebody has not had that experience, they will make lots of tiny little mistakes that, again, they're just tells. Like one that I've seen recently is people are writing mRNA, but they're writing it with a capital M. If you've done any, like even a fraction of what I've done there, you just know, like in your bones, mRNA is lowercase m and then capital R, capital N, capital A. And you just know it. You know what it stands for, you know all of the details of it, at least at a high level. And then you see somebody who writes capital M, capital R, capital N, capital A, or M dash, either capitalized or not, RNA. Lots of things like this. And immediately, kind of spidey sense goes off and you're like, wait a second. Something is wrong here. And then you start, peeling back the layers and you see, well, okay, they have this kind of superficial body of knowledge that's very easily and quickly acquired, but they don't really have any depth to it at all. And, it's problematic. Like, that alone is not bad. Like, it's fine in fact, it's great to have people try to be an autodidact and try to learn about stuff and expand their knowledge. Where the problem comes, and where it really is today, is that you have all of these people who know very, very little about lots of stuff, and they speak at great detail about things that they clearly know very little about. Non-experts have no way to judge that they don't know anything. So, if you're a non-expert and somebody does mRNA wrong, I don't even know what mRNA is, and then so how would I know that that's, you don't recognize it. The same reason that the person who's writing it wrong doesn't recognize it, the non-expert doesn't see it, and so you kind of take a bunch of shitty information and build a whole false body of knowledge around it. And so the skepticism thing, I mean, one of the quotes that sort of spurned me on today, somebody shared in a group chat that I'm in on, surprisingly, Twitter. But it's from Carl Sagan, and I think it was, be open-minded. I'm probably paraphrasing, but basically says, be open-minded, but not so open-minded that your brain falls out. And the point here is not just about skepticism, obviously, but it's accept the possibility that you could be wrong about something. Know that. I mean, in fact, again, I've talked at some length about epistemology and other ones of these, but one of the aspects of my sort of epistemology, which is more or less scientific epistemology, is that, you never actually have the truth, air quotes truth. What you have is kind of this, based on all of your evidence up to date, the idealized version of it. Obviously, you're a human being and, there are layers to this, beyond this. But the ideal is essentially that you have some approximation of the truth. And you're taking in a bunch of new information constantly and refining your approximation to get closer and closer, ideally asymptotically closer, to the air quotes truth. And I think that's right. More or less. At least that's how I see things. You could, obviously there are philosophies where you're kind of like, well, this could all just be a simulation, or it's just all in your head, or blah, 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 and so there's no objective truth and all that. Yeah, but it effectively, that could all be true. I can't rule it out. But it works pretty well, as far as I can tell, in pretty much every aspect, to assume that there is some external grounded, air quotes, truth. And you're just kind of approximating it. You have a version of that in your head, which is obviously just a shadow of the real thing, but there is some, object out there that you're getting the shadow of. It's not like it's just entirely in your head. And again, if you start saying that what you're experiencing in all of this is just an illusion and has no connection to anything, well then, you might as well just throw everything out the window. It's just kind of silly. So anyway, what I'm saying there is essentially that whatever you think is true, air quotes, you should always be open to updating that. You should always be open to realizing oh, I thought the sun was a big fiery ball of, actually this is an interesting one. You sort of have the idea at one early level, and probably in school, the sun is a big fiery ball of hydrogen fusing. And that's where the heat is coming from. And to some extent, that's not false. It's actually, first approximation, true. And then you start learning a little bit more, and you realize, well, okay, the fusion is happening in the core of the sun. And then it's kind of somehow coming out. You don't necessarily know how at this point. You have some kind of like vague idea of it. And then you start learning more and more, and eventually you realize, well, okay, the heat that's coming from the sun right now is thermal black body radiation out of essentially a plasma. And well, it actually was generated like 1 million years ago in fusion processes in the core of the star, and things have just kind of been bouncing around. It just takes that long for stuff to get out because it's so dense and so big. And not only that, but the fusion, the power density in the core of the sun is order of magnitude like the power density of a human being, which is to say, not much. Fusion events in the sun are very slow. They happen at a very low density by human scale. Now, the sun is massive and you have a ton of them, so it ends up being very, very hot. And there's a ton of fuel and all this. Ton, obviously not a ton. But you start getting these layers, and then there are many, many more layers beyond that you can go. So and I think this is a good kind of example of it, because you're not suddenly saying, well, okay, the sun just doesn't exist and it's actually like a big fire in a chariot that's going over the sky. It's not something that's completely crazy and out of left field. Although if you had enough evidence for that, although it would require an extraordinary, extraordinary amount of evidence, there's a point where you could change your model entirely. In all of those layers, you're essentially kind of, like, it's true, the sun is a sort of fusing ball of hydrogen and a little bit of helium and some, what astronomers like to refer to as metals, which are just anything heavier, which is kind of weird, but it's always bothered me, but never mind that now. The first approximation that you had is true, air quotes true, to some extent, but there are a lot of details that you're missing. And even the more detailed approximation that I spoke of, toward the end of that, it's true, again, air quotes true, but there is a lot more going on there. And when you start getting into like, I don't know, magnetohydrodynamics and the way that the solar corona is heated and things like this, there's a lot of stuff going on there that I didn't even touch on and that you probably wouldn't understand. And I don't mean that you wouldn't understand it, but I mean, like, I don't understand it. And it's really, there's stuff that is beyond the current state of the art of understanding. But that's not to say that we don't understand, like, in broad strokes, how the stuff works. There's just a lot of detail there and many, many lifetimes worth of study that could be applied to just tiny little aspects of that. And I mean, it's one of the things that's amazing about sort of the sum of human knowledge and how we got where we are. Like, I'm convinced, generally speaking, and I'm not trying to, this is again, first approximation. I'm convinced, generally speaking, human intelligence, in just on an abstract level, is not particularly greater than any other mammalian intelligence. Now, we have some things that are probably a little bit more advanced, some things less. Obviously, like, there are many examples where other primates have demonstrably much better short-term memory than we do. But broad strokes, we're all kind of, like, the power level is roughly in kind of the same ballpark. It's not like we're massively, massively smarter than all the other animals. What we have that other animals don't is the ability to take, not even necessarily the smartest of us, but just kind of like average people's insights over time and write them down and communicate them to each other and then pass them on and then build from those. So you might have like one insight. Now, I think in terms of like major insights, I suspect it's probably not even one per lifetime. I think it's one major, and on average, like maybe 10 people realize the same thing, but out of 100 people, they 10 realize it. So it's kind of like 1 in 10 insights per lifetime. You have a small number of insights and they get shared and built upon. And the next thing you know, when you have millions and billions of people all piling those tiny little insights together, you have something that's actually well, I was going to say massive. It's really insubstantial compared to all the possible knowledge that's out there. But compared to what an individual could possibly realize, like the smartest individual in the universe, well, let's just say on the planet, you could imagine a super intelligence that could figure out everything that an average person knows today within a lifetime, or a super long-lived person who could figure out that stuff. But generally speaking, the sum of human knowledge compared to what a person could know or could learn by themselves is massive. It's orders and orders of magnitude more, and it gets us all of this. The thing that I'm recording this on, I mean, you think about just the device that this is being recorded on is so many people spending really, and saying a lifetime is not that much of an exaggeration. They spend decades of their lives working on some tiny aspect of it, figuring out like, okay, this is how you build a transistor. This is how you build, just in terms of programming, like how you make a compiler, how you write programming language. And then you think like this is probably written in Swift, or at least a decent part of it. Swift itself is many people worth of work, but it's also built on, and is one of the beautiful things about Swift. Incidentally, if you're interested in learning a programming language, strongly advocate that one. But Swift itself is built on so many languages, and if you know a few languages and a few language families, you can kind of see it. But they've taken the best out of these other, like there's good stuff from Haskell, which is a relatively, if you're a computer scientist, you know it, but random person probably doesn't know Haskell. You might know Java or C or JavaScript or Perl or Python or Ruby, whatever. But Haskell's a little bit more obscure. There's good stuff from Haskell in Swift. There's good stuff from Lisp in Swift. They've taken all of this, and each one of those languages is many lifetimes worth of work. And that's just the programming language. Now get into the compiler, like taking that language and translating it into machine code. Get into the CCD, the optical sensor that's doing this, the like layer, the stack up of lenses that are like fucking tiny as shit and precisely placed to like microns in position over a sensor, and being able to be moved by tiny bits. The optical sensor that itself is on a platform that moves. All of these things are many lifetimes worth of work. The smartest person in the world, like you can understand vaguely kind of how all this stuff works, probably couldn't figure out a fraction of that yourself. And then that doesn't even get into like the metallurgy or the glass. The glass process is like literally thousands of years worth of human development, crystallized, so to speak, in this amorphous sort of material with all of these special properties that, it's just so many layers of refinement, and being able to mill that glass precisely. And then you look at how you're making a CNC mill and doing that at scale, and all of these things, so many layers. I'm really convinced, like, if you had, I'm not going to say that necessarily dogs are about as smart as a person, although I do think they're in the ballpark. If dogs had well, obviously, they're going to have trouble manipulating things. You can see dogs sometimes use their paws, but imagine that they have sort of some kind of like a prehensile thumb or some way to really grab stuff and move it around. If they had a means of communication and archiving that could go beyond the lifetime of a dog, the level that they could get to, I don't think is that far beyond, or behind rather, where humans could be. So again, like blathering on and the whole point of what I want to talk about today is essentially that, expertise, I wish that I had a really compact, concise, pithy way of saying this, but the expertise is not everything. Being skeptical is good, but expertise means something. It means a lot. And being skeptical, it's I guess I'm trying to think of a good way to really get into what I'm trying to say there. But like there's this whole idea of vaccine air quotes skepticism, which is really in vogue right now. It's one of the frustrations of my life because I took, not to date myself here, but in the 90s in undergrad, I took virology. And that was my first virology course. Now, I had obviously, in biology and in microbiology, um, and in other courses I had taken before, I'd studied viruses a little bit, but I took my first virology course. One of my favorite professors, Dr. Jacobs, well, it was team taught by three guys, but this guy, and then his postdoc who looked like a younger, not exactly clone, but like they both had beards, they both kind of looked like they were going for the same thing. And then this other guy, I don't know if he was an assistant professor at the time or another postdoc or whatever. But anyway, Dr. Jacobs specifically was a great, obviously not a perfect person, but for my style of learning, great professor. And one of the things I loved about him was that he would go off on these tangents, and they were not just like random tangents, but they were things that were pertinent, and then he would always kind of weave them back into the whole thing. Now there are people I do notice who, and if you're like this, obviously you're not in my, well, I hate to say audience, but you're probably not the person that's gonna want to watch this or listen to it. You're not the person who would enjoy it, but there are people who really want a straight linear path from A to B. And I'm a much bigger fan of kind of like, well, okay, we're going to get eventually to B, but while we're talking about this, we're going to go off on all of these sort of side, journeys that all ultimately end up giving us more information. Like you'll still get to B, but you'll have a much broader tapestry of understanding when you get there. And you'll have the groundwork for a lot more, for going like to D and to Z, rather than just, like, okay, you got to B. Now, if we hold your hand, we can take you to C in the same way. And also you're kind of stuck on this linear path versus with the tangents, you're kind of filling stuff in. And one thing that I mentioned this with genetics, but one thing I really notice in academia is like you'll cover the same topics over and over again. And it's not just repetition or rote memorization. It's that each time you're kind of painting layers. You're getting a little bit more depth. You're getting a little bit more complexity. You're getting a little bit more understanding. And as I'm going through that sort of example of a star, your picture of how the star works, even at the simplest level, is changing. So once you know all of those larger levels of detail, you can hear that original, like, well, the star is kind of a big fiery ball of plasma that's fusing. And same words that you might have heard to get the summary, but now you have in your mind, well, okay, this is sort of the structure of it. It has, the core that's being compressed, and it's, all of these properties. That's where the fusion's taking place, and it's diffusing, and all of this stuff. And it's interesting. Like, I think about this with transcription and translation, immunology. I've taken a bunch of courses on immunology, and every time you study it, you learn more. And in a way that, like, if you took the same original course, you would actually get new stuff out of that original course that you didn't in the first time, because you didn't have the soil prepared to grow some of the seeds that they were planting. Now, ideally, you have those seeds still, and then, as you learn the more layers, you can kind of start thinking about it and reflecting on it and getting them to germinate. But we don't have eidetic memories, generally speaking. And even if you have a good memory, even if you did have a completely eidetic memory, you're probably not going back through that class and replaying it and then thinking about everything that was going on in that class and then thinking about, oh, well, they said this. At the time, I didn't even get it, and this actually means this and this and this. It's, so it gets to, I hope that gets some kind of like at least a high level understanding of what expertise is. One of the unfortunate things is, I suspect, I know, of the people that I know who are watching this or listening to it, um, they're pretty much, first off, pretty much aligned with me politically. Pretty much, not necessarily the same background, but like if your background is in sociology or in electrical engineering, and you have a pretty advanced degree there, and you have advanced understanding, you're not that far from where I am. The frustrating thing is the person who I would probably be best spending my time talking with is the person who doesn't have any of that. The person who is like, oh, I'm studying all of this stuff on YouTube or on some Udemy or some online education system, Curiosity Stream, and because I've got this, I know how to do the simple harmonic oscillator, and yeah, kind of. I mean, you might be able to work out the differential equations. You might be able to have like some understanding of the quantum operators for it and wave functions and all of this kind of stuff. But I've studied the simple harmonic oscillator in I don't even know how many classes, probably dozens of classes, like literally, in like solid state physics and quantum mechanics. And I've taken quantum mechanics several times. In every class, you talk about the simple harmonic oscillator. Every time you take classical mechanics, simple harmonic oscillator comes up. When you take every layer of physics, that comes up. When we take certain math classes or differential equations, that comes up. And so you'd think, why would you? I mean, this is a simple system, air quotes simple. And yeah, it is, but there's so much depth to this system. And this is, generally speaking, I mean, it depends on how you consider it and how much detail you're going into. But if you're just talking about like the linear simple harmonic oscillator, where you have an idealized restoring force that is linear with distance from the center, that already is extremely rich. Like you could develop most of quantum mechanics working on that, and most of basic classical mechanics working on that. A lot of differential equations and this kind of stuff. And then you start peeling back the layers and you think, well, okay, well, if it's a physical spring or if it's a pendulum, then it's actually nonlinear. And, that oh, shit, I thought I kind of understood it. Now, you think you kind of understand it at a classical level, and then you go into the quantum level, and then it's like, well, this is weird. And I don't mean that it's weird in the sort of woo sense that people talk about quantum mechanics, but I mean, it's like there's a lot of stuff there that's happening and that you're not getting from the classical picture. And then you talk about it in, like numerical methods, how to just integrate that thing out. It's pretty fucking crazy. Again, simple thing. And there's so much detail there. If you try to turn it into a finite difference equation and then propagate it forward in time, you can do it. If you're somebody who's watching this and you know a little bit about programming, a couple hours you could figure that out, probably. Yet there's a reason that people spend their lives working on numerical methods, because there's so much there, and also like knowing what to do and how to do it and not really catching the why. It gives you the illusion that you know much more than you do. This is the problem that I have with things like Curiosity Stream. Like it is awesome that people have so much access to information and even a little bit of knowledge, but it really decontextualizes everything, and it really takes away many layers of depth and a lot of kind of grounding in reality. It also makes you think. I mean, it like feeds this Dunning-Kruger thing where you're like, oh, I totally understand this. You can, back to the simple harmonic oscillator, the inverted pendulum is a classical example, not in the classical mechanics sense, but classical in that. Anyway, it is an example of a control problem that pretty much anyone who's ever done control theory, I think, has at some point in some way studied it. And you probably, it's again one of these things where you can go back to it many times, and it's ridiculous how much just like balancing a broom on your hand, how much depth there is there and how much use there is for that, and how much it teaches you about where things break down and what control laws do. So you can, if you know a little bit about robotics, you can probably figure out what a PID controller is. Proportional integral derivative controller. It's basically like you take the error and you make a control law that has basically three free parameters. One is how far you are from, the place you're aiming for. One is the derivative of how far you are, so how much that's changing. And then the other is sort of the integral over time of how far you have been over time. Those things give you a very general controller, and it turns out, like, if you know a lot about control theory, it's secretly, like a state space controller, and it has all of these other layers to it. But you don't realize that when you study it. And so you can feel like, oh, I made a robot that balances on two wheels. And it's, I feel like I know what I'm doing. Okay, well now, yeah, now try to make it stand up. Now try to make it be two pendulums on top of each other. Now try to do, you start adding layers to this, and it falls apart predictably. And it sort of lets you see, oh, maybe, well, hopefully, in the ideal case, you realize I didn't actually understand it as well as I did, or as well as I thought. And you start, I mean, it's an annoying thing, actually. Like, I have gone, with control theory, I've gone sort of the autodidact path and then back to a little bit more sort of regimented academic version of it. You can learn a lot about it before you actually start understanding a lot of these things. It's so tempting also. Like, you look at these plant diagrams and you're like, well, why do I have to learn what a transfer function is? Why do I have to learn about Laplace transforms and all this kind of stuff? And you might even, depending on the kind of controller you're building, you might not even be using those things directly. But, if you build all of that stuff up and you don't understand that stuff, it leads to bad things, because you will have problems that people have known about in classical control theory forever, and you won't see how to fix them, and you won't even understand what the problem is. It's one thing, like I finally got the beta, the full self-driving beta for Tesla. And I mean, just in that, like, the air quotes safety score that they used, I could do an episode on how bad that is. I might have talked about it before, but it's based on statistics of rare events. And, you have, like, essentially it is a Poisson process. So you have this random events that are not correlated, which is just, like radiation or anything like this, where you have two things that just, the probability, I guess a better example is like rolling dice or flipping a coin. 10 flips of a coin come up heads, the next one still has 50-50 chances, unless there's some bias inherent in the coin. The past doesn't really influence the future. And they're sampling, say, order of 1,000 miles per week or whatever time period. And then you start looking at, okay, well, they're expecting, and I'm using one particular example there, but they're expecting about 10 events to happen. That's the fleet median. And then you do the math on this, and okay, well, out of 10 event kind of outcomes, you would expect to see shockingly many people with 2 of those events, shockingly many people with 18 of those events. And they're making these judgments about how, air quotes, safe you are based on what essentially, like, even if everybody was a uniform population and was equally skilled, which obviously is not true, but imagine everybody had no differentiation between them, you would see this distribution that looks like there's some kind of variation in how safe people are. And in reality, it's just random, just chance that they're measuring and trying to infer something from. So anyway, you get to the control stuff, and I will say the vision system that they've built is very impressive. I do think it has some problems that I don't know that they understand, but it's very impressive. It's a good piece of work. The path planning system, the controller that they're using, all of this kind of stuff, you can tell how they're doing it. It's an interesting thing also when you're kind of an expert at something. The example I would always use is you hear a car and it's squeaking in a certain way, and you're a mechanic and you're like, it's a timing belt, and it's this belt in particular, and this is the problem, or this is not really a problem. And like, oh, the brake shoes are just completely destroyed. That car needs to be. And you just know these things because you have developed that expertise and you even know how to fix it and all this kind of stuff. Um, you can tell, you can feel it, how they're doing this control. And the way that they're doing it is not really, I don't think, going to converge on a timely, in any kind of reasonable amount of time. They're taking a high dimensional optimization problem. They're doing this like neural control kind of stuff, which sounds good, and you can do lots of really cool stuff with it. But if you don't understand the underlying problem, like neural control is really good and useful for certain things. If you don't understand classical control theory, you're going to run into these things that you just don't even. And also, I mean, this is like, just imagine you understand analysis, like basic math and function theory. When I say basic math, I don't mean like, 1 and 1 is 2, but I mean, like, oh, you have the domain and you have the range and you have these functions that map from here to here and you have continuity and this kind of stuff. Neural networks basically at a very high level are, and it's more complicated than this, but they're basically just arbitrary functions that map from one space to another. And even in the names like TensorFlow, they're mapping from some sort of curved manifold to another one. There's more to it than that, but that's kind of like what it's doing. And if you put in enough parameters and you give enough, you can map pretty much any function. But the problem is, if you have too many parameters, you're going to have all kinds of weird shit going on that's not real. And, that ends up causing a lot of problems. You can see also, like, some of the things that they do. There are things that you could, if you knew what you were doing, go on a straight path and fix it. But because, and I know this is probably arrogant to think that they don't know this, but I'm pretty sure that the people working on this stuff know neural control and they know a lot of this stuff, but they haven't done the basic foundational work. They have a lot of Dunning-Kruger, and so they're kind of, and hopefully I'm not suffering from Dunning-Kruger to even say this, but they're doing things that just are not going to converge. They're going to keep getting improvements and then not be nearly there. And I think it's not totally hopeless. Like, if you take their approach and you keep at it for long enough and you spend enough compute cycles and a shit ton of energy, you can get pretty much there. But there are much faster, easier paths to doing it. And then this is all without having, any kind of understanding of what the car is doing. The car is basically just following a navigation map. The car doesn't have or need really any understanding of what it's doing or why, or any deeper layers than this. But anyway, I have a meeting coming up, and so I'm gonna have to cut this short being almost an hour. Hopefully that was not too like, but anyway, thanks to the new people who are coming on. I appreciate, it's both nice to know that there are more people listening or watching, and also a little unnerving because it's kind of, I feel a little bit more pressure. In my mind, if I'm just like sitting here blathering to myself, I want to do a decent job, but it's, a lower bar to clear. When you know that people are listening, it's like, oh shit, And when it's like Gil or my mom or BG or a lot of the other people that I know are listening, lower threshold starts getting, as that grows a little bit, it feels a little bit more like, not that that's going to change too much of what I do. Hopefully it will focus me a little bit more and sharpen things a little bit more. But thanks for listening. I do appreciate it. I hope that I've not said anything ridiculously out there that was wrong. But if I did, and you showed, this is going to be actually the last thing I say. Whenever I've taught a course, I always, as soon as I came up with this, always afterwards, as extra credit, offered this thing where it was prove me wrong. And I didn't do it to like say, oh, I'm perfect. My idea here was basically, if you can show me, like I said something that was wrong, and you show like just some kind of a citation or reference that demonstrates that, you'll get points. And some people like extra credit. I never had anybody take me up on that one. And it always annoyed me because I would always catch myself making like small mistakes. And it's disturbing actually, because if you make a small mistake in the class and people don't have, you're the professor or you're the teacher. When I was TAing Mike 206, Introductory Microbiology Lab, one year, one time in one class, I said genre instead of genera of bacteria. And I corrected myself immediately. Immediately. And yet, that whole semester, I had students saying, like coming back and saying genre. And I mean, this is obviously like a minor correction, but it's also like, if you say genre and you're talking about species and taxonomy, people are going to like, it's going to raise some eyebrows. You don't sound like you know what you're talking about. And it also is something that really has scared me, because it's like, well, okay, if you're teaching something and you say something, and especially you say it authoritatively, and I mean, just in the sense that you're a professor, you already have that level of authority. People will just kind of believe you. And it gets to this other side of this, which is it's important to have a little bit of skepticism. It's important not to just take authority at its word. But at the same time, you have to have the right balance where, yeah, skepticism, just not too much. Authority doesn't mean everything, but it means a lot. And having that balance and finding it and understanding it, I think is one of those kind of key, sort of compasses to building real knowledge and understanding. So with that, I really do have to go. I'm gonna basically gonna stop this and then immediately hop on a Zoom. So I'm excited about that. Thank you very much for listening or watching, and talk to you next week. Zaijian.